The dining room had gone completely silent. 42 people, crystal glasses, a five-tier cake nobody had touched yet, and my mother-in-law, Diane Whitfield, standing at the head of the table with a champagne flute in one hand, looking directly at me like I was something she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. "I'll say what everyone at this table is thinking," she said, her voice carrying easily over the silence she'd created. "Marrying you was the biggest mistake my daughter ever made." Someone's fork hit a plate. A child laughed at something unrelated in the next room, the sound strange and out of place. My wife, Renee, went with the color of the tablecloth. I didn't move. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even put down my glass. I just looked at her and said, "Are you finished?" Diane blinked. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected tears, or anger, or my wife jumping up to defend me, something dramatic enough to justify the scene she'd just made in front of her entire family on her 40th wedding anniversary. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 3 days earlier I'd sat across from a notary public and signed paperwork that would change the ownership of the very house we were all sitting in. She had no idea that the woman who'd spent 8 years calling me the help my daughter married was about to learn exactly who she'd been talking to. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this actually started. 6 months earlier, on an ordinary Tuesday, when I got a phone call that changed everything. If you believe the calmest person in the room is usually the one with the most to reveal, stick around, because you have not seen anything yet. Hit subscribe, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and let's get into it. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 38 years old, and for the past 8 years, I've been married to a woman named Renee Whitfield, now Renee Webb, though her mother never once called me by my own name in 8 years of marriage. To Diane, I was always him, or Renee's husband, said with the same inflection most people reserve for describing an inconvenient weather pattern. I met Renee at a conference in Charlotte. I was 30 years old, working as a structural engineer for a mid-sized firm, the kind of job that pays well but never makes anyone's eyes light up at a dinner party. Renee was a corporate attorney, sharp and funny in a way that caught me completely off guard, with a laugh that made strangers turn their heads in restaurants. We talked for 4 hours that first night. I knew by the end of it that I wanted to marry her. What I didn't know yet was that I'd also be marrying her mother. Diane Whitfield is, a formidable woman, 64 years old when this story begins, silver-haired, immaculately dressed, the kind of person who walks into a room and expects it to rearrange itself around her. She'd built a real estate brokerage from nothing in the 80s, raised 2 daughters mostly alone after her husband died young, and never let anyone forget either fact. She wore her self-made success like armor, and she'd decided long before I ever showed up that whoever married her daughters needed to meet a certain bar. I did not meet that bar, not in Diane's eyes. The first time I met her, at a Sunday dinner 4 months into dating Renee, Diane looked me up and down across the table and said, "An engineer, so you build things other people design." I laughed because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. That set the tone for the next 8 years. It wasn't loud cruelty, not at first. It was smaller than that, the kind of thing you can't quite point to without sounding paranoid. She'd introduce me to her friends as Renee's husband, and let the sentence end there, no name attached, like I was a fact about her daughter rather than a person in my own right. She'd ask Renee, in front of me, whether she'd considered what her life might have looked like if she'd ended up with someone from her own world. She'd send Renee articles about successful men in finance and law with no caption at all, just the link, dropped into a text thread, the implication doing all the talking. Renee saw it. She wasn't blind to her mother's behavior, but Diane was also the only parent Renee had left, and there's a particular kind of loyalty that forms in people who lost a parent young, a reluctance to lose the other one too, even when that parent is actively wounding the people you love. I understood that. I never asked Renee to choose between us because I didn't think it was fair to make her. So I did what I'd done since the day I met Diane Whitfield. I stayed calm. I was polite. I showed up to every holiday, every birthday, every Sunday dinner, and I let the comments slide off me like rain off a coat. Not because they didn't land. They did, more than I ever let on, even to Renee, but because I'd made a decision early on that I wasn't going to give Diane the satisfaction of a reaction. She wanted a villain to confirm her story about me. I wasn't going to play that part. What Diane never understood, what she still didn't understand on the night of that anniversary dinner, was that the version of me she'd built in her head over 8 years of small cruelties was not the version of me that actually existed. She'd been so busy looking for evidence to confirm what she'd already decided about me that she never once stopped to ask who I actually was, what I actually did, or what I was actually capable of. That gap, between who Diane thought I was and who I actually was, is where this entire story lives. 3 years into the marriage, Renee's father's old business partner, a man named Walter Cho, reached out to me out of nowhere. Renee's father, Diane's late husband, had co-founded a small but profitable commercial property management company back in the 80s, before he passed. Walter had run it solo for 2 decades since, and now, in his 70s, he was looking to sell. He didn't reach out to Renee. He didn't reach out to Diane, who still held a minority stake in the company from her husband's estate. He reached out to me, specifically, because in the years I'd been coming to Sunday dinners and saying very little, Walter had been quietly watching how I thought. He'd seen me help Renee's cousin restructure a failing rental property analysis at a family barbecue 2 years earlier, almost as an afterthought, the kind of math I did in my head, the way other people check their phones. You see things other people don't, Walter told me over coffee. I want to sell to someone who'll actually run this thing well, not strip it for parts. You interested? I was interested. More than interested. I'd spent a decade in structural engineering, quietly fascinated by the commercial property side of the business, the kind of interest you don't mention at dinner parties because it sounds boring to everyone except the people who actually understand it. I didn't tell Diane. I barely told Renee the full scope of it at first, not because I was hiding anything, but because I wanted to be sure it was real before I made it a topic of conversation in a family that had spent 3 years deciding I wasn't worth taking seriously. Over the following 18 months, with Renee's full knowledge and support, I negotiated the purchase of Walter's majority stake using a combination of my savings, a business loan, and, critically, an agreement that let me buy out Diane's minority stake as well, at fair market value, structured quietly through the estate's attorney so it wouldn't require a family conversation Diane wasn't ready to have. Diane signed the paperwork without reading it closely. She'd been told by her own financial advisor, not by me, that an offer had come in for her minority stake in a company she'd never been involved in running, at a price that was, frankly, generous. She took the money. She never asked who the buyer was. The paperwork listed a holding company, not my name. By the time our 4th wedding anniversary rolled around, I owned the entire company that Renee's late father had built. Diane had no idea. Neither did Renee's sister, Paige, who lived 2 states away and had even less involvement in the family business than Diane did. I want to be clear about something here, because it matters for what comes later. I didn't do this to set a trap. I wasn't thinking 8 moves ahead like some kind of chess player plotting a humiliation. I bought the company because it was a good business, because Walter trusted me to run it well, and because, for the first time in my adult life, I had the chance to build something that was entirely mine, something Diane Whitfield's opinion of me had absolutely nothing to do with. The fact that it would matter later wasn't part of the plan. It was just what happened to be true. The company, Whitfield Property Group, a name I kept out of respect for Renee's father, though almost no one in the family realized that's whose name it carried, grew steadily over the next 4 years. I hired a small, sharp team. I renovated 2 of the older commercial properties that Walter had let slide in his last years running things. I picked up 3 new buildings in a growth corridor outside the city that nobody else had spotted yet. By year 8 of my marriage to Renee, the year this story actually begins, Whitfield Property Group managed 11 commercial properties worth a combined value north of $40 million. I'd taken something that had quietly stagnated for 2 decades and turned it into the most successful chapter of its existence. And through all of it, at every Sunday dinner, every holiday, every birthday, Diane Whitfield still introduced me as Renee's husband and asked me, with a faint and practiced condescension, how the building stuff was going. I always said, "It's going well, Diane." I never elaborated, not because I was protecting some grand secret, though I suppose, looking back, I was, but because Diane had never once asked a follow-up question in 8 years. She asked the question the way you ask a child how school is going. She wasn't actually curious about the answer. She was performing politeness for an audience of one, herself. So I let her perform it. I gave her exactly as much engagement as she'd ever given me, which is to say, almost none, and I went home every Sunday and built something real with the woman I loved, in a life Diane Whitfield had decided, 8 years earlier, wasn't good enough for her daughter. If you've ever sat in a room and let someone underestimate you because the alternative, correcting them, wasn't worth your energy, comment the word patience below. I want to know how many of you have lived a version of this story. The anniversary dinner had been Renee's idea, not mine. It's their 40th wedding anniversary, she said, which was technically inaccurate. Her father had passed 11 years earlier, and Diane had remarried briefly to a man named Roger, who lasted 4 years before the divorce. But in Diane's revised version of family history, the 40th anniversary referred to the year her real estate brokerage had opened its doors, a milestone she'd quietly rebranded as an anniversary worth celebrating once she realized her actual wedding anniversaries were too complicated to commemorate without acknowledging Roger. I didn't push back on the framing. It wasn't worth the energy, and Renee wanted to do something nice for her mother, who, whatever her flaws, had raised 2 daughters alone after losing a husband, and deserved at least one night of being celebrated by her family without complication. So we planned it. Renee handled the guest list, 42 people, family and close friends, Diane's entire social circle from the brokerage and the country club, and 2 decades of charity board memberships. I handled the venue, which turned out to be more complicated than expected because the property Diane had specifically requested, a restored colonial mansion an hour outside the city, the kind of place with white columns and a ballroom that photographed beautifully for the society page Diane still cared about, was owned by a holding company. My holding company. I want to pause here and explain something, because this detail matters more than it might seem at first. 18 months earlier, Whitfield Property Group had acquired a struggling historic property called Ashford Manor, a colonial-era estate that had been converted into an event venue sometime in the 90s, then slowly fell into disrepair under an owner who didn't have the capital or the vision to maintain it properly. I'd seen the listing, recognized what it could become with the right investment, and bought it as a long-term project, the kind of property you take on not because the numbers work immediately, but because you can see what they'll become in 5 years. We'd spent a year restoring it. New roof, refinished hardwood, restored gardens, a completely rebuilt ballroom with the original chandeliers rewired and rehung. It had reopened for events 4 months before Renee mentioned, completely independently, that Ashford Manor was the venue Diane had been talking about for her party for the last 2 years. Some gorgeous old estate she saw in a magazine once and never stopped mentioning. I didn't tell Renee I owned it. I told her I'd make some calls and see what I could do about availability and pricing. I made the calls to myself. Again, I want to be honest about my own intentions here, because it would be easy to make this sound more calculated than it was. I wasn't trying to engineer a confrontation. I genuinely thought it would be a nice surprise for Renee to be able to give her mother the exact venue she'd always wanted, at a price our family could actually afford, because the owner happened to be willing to work with us. The owner was always going to be willing to work with us. The owner was me. I told Renee I'd negotiated a friend of the family discount through a business contact. She was thrilled. She told her mother the party would be at Ashford Manor, and Diane, for the only time in 8 years, looked at me with something that wasn't quite warmth, but wasn't quite contempt either. A neutral, surprised respect, the kind you might give a stranger who'd done something mildly impressive. "How did you manage that?" she asked. "I heard that place is booked a year out." "I know someone," I said. It was, technically, the truth. The 6 weeks leading up to the anniversary dinner were, by Diane Whitfield standards, almost pleasant. She called Renee more than usual to discuss flower arrangements and seating charts. She sent me a single text message, the first unprompted text she'd ever sent me directly in 8 years of marriage, asking if I had any pull with the caterer to upgrade the dessert table. I did, obviously. I owned the venue. The caterer worked events at Ashford Manor every month and would have done almost anything I asked. I told Diane I'd see what I could do, and 3 days later, the caterer called Renee to say they could absolutely accommodate the upgraded dessert table at no additional charge, as a courtesy. Diane was delighted. For 6 entire weeks, I existed in her world as someone marginally more useful than she'd previously believed. Not a person she respected exactly, but a person who'd apparently developed some unexpected utility, like a tool she hadn't realized was in the garage. I let her believe whatever story she wanted to tell herself about why things were suddenly going so smoothly. I didn't correct it. I didn't explain. I just kept showing up, kept being quietly useful, kept saying almost nothing about myself, the same pattern I'd maintained for 8 years, except this time, every quiet thing I wasn't saying was building towards something neither Diane nor Renee could see coming. I told you earlier that I wasn't engineering a trap. I want to be honest now and say that by the third week of planning, watching Diane's tone toward me soften in direct proportion to a series of favors she didn't know were simply me exercising ownership over my own property, I started to understand, for the first time, exactly how this party was going to go. Not because I planned it, because I finally understood Diane Whitfield well enough, after 8 years, to know exactly what she would do when the moment came. 2 weeks before the party, Renee's sister Paige flew in early to help with final preparations. Paige was different from Diane in almost every way except one. She had absorbed, completely uncritically, every story her mother had ever told about me. Paige had met me maybe a dozen times in 8 years, lived a comfortable distance away in Denver, and had built her entire opinion of her brother-in-law on secondhand commentary from a woman who'd never once asked me a real question about my life. Over dinner the week before the party, Paige asked Renee, in front of me, whether she'd ever thought about what life would look like if she'd ended up with someone more like Daniel, Paige's husband, a hedge fund analyst who talked about his job at every family gathering, whether anyone had asked or not. Renee's jaw tightened. I have the life I want, Paige. I'm just saying, Paige continued, oblivious or indifferent to the tension she was creating. Mom worries about you. She's always worried you settled. I sat there, eating my dinner, saying nothing, the same way I'd said nothing for 8 years. But something had shifted in me by that point. Not anger exactly, but a kind of clarity. I'd spent 8 years absorbing this family's quiet contempt because I loved Renee and didn't want to make her choose between us. I'd built an entire company, restored a historic property, and quietly become the financial backbone of a family that still introduced me without a name. I didn't need them to know any of it. I genuinely made peace with that, more or less, somewhere around year 5. But I was also done pretending their opinion of me had any bearing on who I actually was. That distinction, between not needing recognition and not caring what was said about me, turned out to matter a great deal. 3 days later, when Diane Whitfield stood up at the head of a table in a ballroom she didn't know I owned, and said the words that would end, in one sentence, 8 years of careful silence. If a story like this is hitting close to home, if you've ever built something real while the people closest to you underestimated every bit of it, comment the word built below. Let's keep going. I want to tell you about one more conversation before we get to the night itself, because it's the moment I came closest to telling Renee everything, and I think it matters that I didn't. 3 days before the party, Renee and I were in the car together, driving back from a final walkthrough at Ashford Manor, a walkthrough I'd arranged to look, from her perspective, like a courtesy visit the venue had offered us as the booking family, when in reality it was simply me doing my job as the owner, checking on staging for an event 2 days out. Renee was quiet for most of the drive, the kind of quiet I'd learned over 8 years to recognize as her working through something. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally, somewhere on the highway, streetlights passing overhead in steady rhythm. "Of course. Do you ever resent her, my mom, for how she's treated you?" I thought about that question carefully because it deserved a careful answer, and because some part of me, some part that had been quietly carrying 8 years of small humiliations, wanted, badly, to finally say yes, to finally let Renee see the weight of it. Sometimes, I admitted, not often. Mostly, I just feel sad about it. Sad that she spent 8 years deciding who I am instead of finding out. Sad that she's missed out on actually knowing the person her daughter married. I could talk to her, Renee said. Before the party, I could ask her to be better, to actually try for once. "Don't," I said, more firmly than I'd intended, and Renee glanced over at me, surprised. "Why not?" I considered, for a long moment, telling her everything right then: the company, the loan guarantee, the venue we'd just walked through, all of it. The words were right there, ready to surface after 8 years of staying quiet. I could have ended the mystery 3 days early, in the safety of a car on a quiet highway, instead of in a ballroom in front of 42 witnesses. I didn't, because this isn't your fight to manage, I told her instead. It's not your job to fix your mother's behavior toward me. I appreciate that you want to, more than you know, but I need you to trust that I can handle whatever happens at that party. I've been handling it for 8 years. Renee reached over and took my hand, the same gesture she'd repeat 3 days later, under a different kind of pressure entirely. You shouldn't have had to handle it alone for 8 years, she said quietly. Maybe not, I said. But I did, and I think, after everything, it's going to be okay. I didn't tell her why I believed that, with such quiet certainty. I didn't tell her that I suspected, somewhere in the part of my mind that had spent 8 years cataloging every one of Diane's small cruelties, that the dam was close to breaking, that Diane's restraint over 6 weeks of unexpected favors and unexplained generosity was not going to hold indefinitely, and that when it broke, I wanted to be the one holding the truth, not the one still waiting for permission to share it. I just held Renee's hand the rest of the drive home and let her believe for 3 more days that whatever happened at that party, we'd face it together, which was true, even if she didn't yet understand the full shape of what together was about to mean. Ashford Manor looked extraordinary that evening. I'd walked its halls 100 times during the renovation, watched the ballroom go from peeling plaster to restored grandeur one decision at a time, but I'd never seen it dressed for an event of this size. String lights crossed the garden where cocktail hour would begin. The chandeliers in the ballroom, the ones I'd personally approved the rewiring budget for, 11 months earlier, threw warm light across round tables set with white linens and low arrangements of white peonies and eucalyptus. Renee stood beside me in the entrance hall, wearing a dark green dress, looking at the space with an expression I'd rarely seen on her: pure, uncomplicated happiness. "It's perfect," she said. "She's going to love it." "I hope so," I said, and meant it. Whatever my history with Diane, I wanted this night to go well for Renee. That part was never in question. Guests began arriving around 6. I shook hands, made small talk, did the work that every spouse does at these events, refilled drinks, found seats for elderly relatives, and made sure the bar staff knew which of Diane's friends liked their gin a particular way. I moved through the role of Renee's husband, the same way I had for 8 years. Competent, present, invisible. Diane arrived fashionably late, in a silver dress, greeting guests with the practiced warmth of someone who'd spent 4 decades hosting events for her real estate clients. She thanked Renee extravagantly for the venue, told 3 separate groups of guests how impossible it had been to book Ashford Manor, and credited the achievement, vaguely, to connections. She did not mention me by name in any of these conversations. I was standing 8 feet away from 2 of them. Dinner was served at 7:30. The toasts began around 8:15, after the main course, while the staff cleared plates for dessert. Renee went first, a warm, funny speech about her mother's resilience, her work ethic, the home she'd built for 2 daughters after losing their father too young. Paige went next, shorter, sentimental, a story about Diane teaching her to drive. Then Diane stood up. I want to describe this moment carefully, because everything that happened afterward depended on what happened in the next 90 seconds. Diane held her champagne flute, looked around the room at 42 guests who'd come to celebrate her, and began with warmth, thanking everyone for coming, thanking Renee for organizing the most beautiful night of my life, thanking Paige for flying in. Her voice carried easily. She'd given 1,000 toasts in her career, knew exactly how to hold a room. Then her eyes moved to me. "I want to say something about family," she continued, and something in her tone shifted, subtle, but I caught it immediately. The particular cadence Diane used when she was about to deliver something she'd rehearsed. Family isn't just the people who share your blood. It's the people who show up, who contribute, who prove year after year that they belong at your table. A pause. The room, sensing a turn, went quiet in the particular way crowds do when they sense something is about to happen. "I'll say what everyone at this table is thinking," Diane said, and her eyes were locked on mine now. unmistakably. Marrying you was the biggest mistake my daughter ever made. The silence that followed was the kind you can feel on your skin. Someone's fork hit a plate. Renee's face drained of color so completely, I genuinely worried, for a half second, that she might faint. Paige's mouth fell open. Across the room I watched Walter Cho, Renee's father's old business partner, the man who'd sold me the company 8 years earlier, the only person at that table besides my own accountant who actually knew what I'd built, go rigid in his seat. Diane wasn't finished. She'd clearly prepared more. 8 years, she continued, her voice rising slightly, performing now for the room as much as speaking to me. 8 years of watching my daughter, a woman with a law degree, a woman who could have had anyone, settle for a man who builds spreadsheets for a living and calls it a career. 8 years of biting my tongue at every holiday because I didn't want to make a scene. Well, I'm done biting my tongue. Renee deserved better. She's always deserved better. I sat very still. This is the part of the story where, if you've been in a situation anything like this, you understand the particular physics of the moment, the way time seems to slow down, the way you become aware of 42 pairs of eyes on you, the way your own heartbeat becomes the loudest sound in the room. There is a version of this moment where I stand up, where my voice shakes, where I say something defensive and wounded that confirms every story Diane has ever told about me, that I'm not good enough, that I don't belong, that her daughter made a mistake. I didn't do that. I set my glass down. I looked at Diane Whitfield, 64 years old, standing at the head of a table in a ballroom she had no idea I owned, having just humiliated me in front of 42 witnesses on what was supposed to be a celebration of family. And I said calmly, "Are you finished?" If you've ever had to hold your composure in the exact moment someone was trying to break it, comment the word control. This is the part where everything turns. Diane blinked. Whatever reaction she'd expected from me, tears, anger, a retreat from the room, "Are you finished?" was clearly not on the list. "Excuse me?" she said. "I asked if you were finished," I repeated, my voice even, conversational almost, the same tone I'd used discussing a building inspection. "Because I'd like to respond, and I want to make sure I'm not interrupting." A ripple moved through the room, not quite a laugh, but something adjacent to one, the sound of 42 people recalibrating in real time. Diane's composure flickered, just slightly, a crack in the performance she'd clearly rehearsed in front of a mirror. "I think I've made myself clear," she said, recovering, trying to reclaim the authority of the room. "You have," I said. "So let me make a few things clear too, since we're being honest with each other tonight." Renee reached for my hand under the table. I felt her fingers, cold and trembling slightly, and I gave them a small squeeze. A signal, I hoped, that I had this, that she didn't need to intervene, that whatever was about to happen, it wasn't going to be the kind of scene that would hurt her further. 8 years ago, I began, standing now, addressing the room the way Diane had. I met a woman at a conference in Charlotte who was smarter than anyone I'd ever talked to, who made me laugh harder in 4 hours than most people manage in 4 years. I knew by the end of that night I wanted to marry her. I still feel exactly that way today. I looked at Renee. Her eyes were wet, but she was watching me steadily now, not the panicked stillness from a moment earlier. "Diane," I continued, turning back to my mother-in-law, "you've called me the help to your friends. You've introduced me at parties without using my name. You've sent my wife articles about successful men with no caption, as if the implication needed no explanation. I know about all of it. I've known for years. I never said anything, because I love your daughter, and I didn't want her to have to choose between us." The room was utterly silent now. Even the catering staff, clearing plates near the kitchen doors, had stopped moving. "You asked tonight whether marrying me was a mistake," I said. "So let me ask you something in return. Do you know what I do for a living, Diane? Not the version you've told yourself for 8 years. The actual answer." Diane's jaw tightened. "You're an engineer," she said, "who plays at real estate on the side, from what I understand." A few quiet, uncomfortable laughs from somewhere near the back of the room, guests who'd absorbed Diane's framing of me over the years without ever questioning it. "Close," I said. "I was a structural engineer. 8 years ago, your late husband's old business partner, Walter, who is sitting right there." I gestured to Walter Cho, who straightened in his chair. He offered to sell me his company, the one your husband co-founded, the one that, at the time, included a minority stake that you held. Diane's expression shifted, the first real flicker of uncertainty I'd seen from her in 8 years. I bought that stake from you 4 years ago, I said. Through a holding company. You signed the paperwork. I don't think you ever read past the signature line. That's not... Diane started, but I continued, gently but without stopping. Over the last 8 years, I've built that company into something your late husband would be proud of. 11 commercial properties, a team of people who trust me to run things well, and 18 months ago, I bought a property that needed someone who could see what it might become, instead of what it currently was. I paused, letting the room sit in that sentence for a moment. You're standing in it right now, Diane. I own Ashford Manor. The reaction across the table moved like a wave. Paige's hand flew to her mouth. A friend of Diane's near the head table audibly gasped. Walter Cho, the only person in the room besides Renee and our accountant who'd known the full scope of what I'd built, was nodding slowly, almost to himself, like a man watching a play he already knew the ending to. Diane's face had gone through 3 distinct expressions in the span of 10 seconds. Disbelief, calculation, and finally something that looked almost like fear, the particular fear of someone realizing they've miscalculated badly in front of an audience they cannot uninvite. That's not possible, she said, but her voice had lost its earlier conviction. I would have known. Renee would have. Renee didn't know either, I said, and I meant it as a kindness. An acknowledgement that this wasn't some conspiracy against Diane specifically. It was simply a part of my life I'd built quietly, the way I'd built everything quietly, because I'd learned a long time ago that this family didn't listen to me when I talked about myself. So I'd stopped talking, and I'd just built. I asked you a question earlier, I continued, whether marrying me was the biggest mistake your daughter ever made. I think the more honest question is whether underestimating me for 8 straight years was the biggest mistake you ever made. I let that sentence sit in the room. I'm not interested in revenge, Diane. I never built any of this to prove anything to you. I built it because Walter believed in me when you never bothered to ask a single real question about who I was. I built it because I wanted to create something for Renee and for our future that had nothing to do with your approval, because I stopped waiting for your approval around year 3. I looked around the room, 42 guests, most of them frozen, a few visibly moved, 1 or 2 looking distinctly uncomfortable on Diane's behalf. But you stood up in a room I own, on a night my wife organized to celebrate you, and told everyone here that I was a mistake. So I think you're owed the truth. All of it. If you believe the truth always finds its moment, even after 8 years of staying silent, comment the word truth below, and let's see how Diane responds to all of this. Diane Whitfield did not handle the next several minutes well. She tried, first, to recover her authority. Well, she said, attempting a laugh that didn't land, I suppose congratulations are in order. I had no idea you'd done so well for yourself. You had no idea, I said, because you never asked. Not once. In 8 years. You asked Daniel about his hedge fund every single time you saw him. You asked Paige's friends about their careers at dinner parties. You never once asked me a real question about my work, because you'd already decided, the first time you met me, exactly who I was. An engineer who builds things other people design. Your words, by the way. The first time we ever spoke. Diane's mouth opened and closed. For the first time in 8 years, I watched her search for words and come up empty. I'm not finished, I said, and I want to be honest with you. Watching this, there was no anger in my voice. I'd had 8 years to process every slight, and by the time this moment arrived, what I felt wasn't rage. It was something closer to relief. The relief of finally saying, out loud, in front of witnesses, what I'd carried quietly for nearly a decade. 3 years ago, you needed a loan to cover a shortfall at the brokerage during a slow quarter. You went to a bank, got turned down twice, and finally got approved through a small business lender with reasonable terms. Do you remember who personally guaranteed that loan, Diane? Her face went pale. I didn't know, she said quietly, and for the first time that night, her voice had lost all of its performance. You didn't know, I confirmed, because the lender structured it through a referral relationship with Whitfield Property Group, and your loan officer never mentioned the guarantor's name unless you asked. You never asked. You just took the approval and moved on. The same way you took the venue. The same way you took the dessert upgrade. The same way you took the minority stake buyout 4 years ago. I turned, briefly, to address the room, rather than just Diane. I'm telling you all of this not to humiliate anyone, I said, but because I think it matters, on a night about family, to understand what family actually looks like. It's not the person standing at the head of the table, delivering the loudest toast. Sometimes it's the person who's been quietly making sure the people around him are okay, for years, without ever needing credit for it. Renee stood up beside me. She hadn't said a word through the entire exchange, but now she reached for my hand and held it, visibly, in front of everyone. "Mom," she said, and her voice was steady, steadier than I think anyone in that room expected. "I love you. But what you just did, what you've done for 8 years, ends tonight. Marcus has never once asked you for an ounce of respect he didn't earn 10 times over. You owe him an apology, not because he needs it, because it's true." Diane stood there, in her silver dress, in a ballroom she'd just learned she had no claim to, in front of 42 guests who'd watched her entire framing of her son-in-law collapse in real time. She started, and stopped. The silence stretched long enough that it became its own kind of answer. What happened next surprised everyone in that room, including me. Walter Cho stood up from his seat near the back of the table. 76 years old, the man who'd quietly handed me his life's work 8 years earlier because he saw something in me that this entire family had spent 8 years refusing to see, and he raised his glass. "I'd like to make a toast," he said, his voice carrying the particular gravity of someone who rarely spoke at length but commanded attention when he did. "I worked alongside Renee's father for 22 years, Walter said. "He built that company from nothing, the same way Diane built her brokerage from nothing. I think he'd be proud of what's become of it, and I think he'd be especially proud of the man his daughter chose to spend her life with, a man I trusted with everything I'd built, 8 years ago, when very few people in this family had bothered to find out who he actually was." He looked directly at me. "To Marcus," Walter said. 8 years of patience most people couldn't manage in 8 days. Glasses rose around the table, slowly at first, then more fully, as guests who just watched an entire family narrative dismantle in front of them decided, individually, which side of this story they wanted to stand on. Diane did not raise her glass. She stood there, alone, at the head of a table that had just very visibly stopped looking to her for validation, in a venue she'd just learned belonged to the man she'd spent 8 years calling a mistake. If you've ever watched a room shift its loyalty in real time, once the truth finally came out, comment the word "shift" below. We're almost at the end of this one. I think it's worth pausing here, before I tell you what happened after the party, to explain exactly what those 8 years had actually cost me. Because Diane was condescending, doesn't fully capture it, and I want you to understand why the moment in that ballroom meant as much as it did. The first Christmas Renee and I spent as a married couple, Diane hosted at her house, the same house she'd lived in since before her husband passed. I arrived with a bottle of wine I'd spent an embarrassing amount of time choosing. A Napa Cabernet I'd read was one of her favorites, mentioned once, in passing, by Renee, months earlier. I handed it to Diane at the door. She looked at the label, said, "Oh, that's sweet," and set it on a side table where, as far as I could tell, it remained unopened for the entire evening while she served a far more expensive bottle she'd selected herself. It was a small thing. It's always small things, with people like Diane. Nothing you can point to in isolation and call cruelty. But small things, repeated over 8 years, accumulate into something with real weight. There was the time, 2 years into the marriage, when Renee was up for a partnership at her law firm, the kind of promotion that takes a decade of work to reach, and Diane spent an entire dinner asking Renee whether she'd thought about scaling back, whether she and I had talked about starting a family soon, whether Renee was sure this was the life she wanted. Not one question about the actual partnership. Not one moment of pride in what her daughter had built. Just a steady, persistent undermining, dressed up as maternal concern. There was Thanksgiving, when Diane's brokerage colleague, a man named Philip, asked me what I did for work, and before I could answer, Diane said, "Oh, Marcus does something with buildings. Don't ask me to explain it," and turned back to her conversation, effectively ending mine before it began. There was the birthday, my 34th, 4 years into the marriage, the same year I quietly finished negotiating Diane's own minority stake buyout when Diane sent Renee a card to give me. Inside, beneath a generic "Happy Birthday" printed on the front, she'd written exactly one line: "Take care of my daughter." Not "Happy Birthday, Marcus." Not a single word was addressed to me as a person separate from my function in Renee's life. Just an instruction, as if I were staff being reminded of my duties. I kept that card, actually. I'm not sure why. Maybe some part of me knew, even then, that there would come a day when all of these small moments would matter, not because I was building toward revenge, but because I needed, somewhere, a record of what I'd actually lived through, in case I ever started to doubt my own memory of it. I never showed it to Renee. I never made her carry the weight of choosing between her mother's behavior and her husband's feelings. That was a decision I made early and never wavered from. Even in the hardest years, even the year my own father passed, 2 years before the anniversary party, and Diane's only acknowledgement was a text message to Renee that read, "Tell Marcus I'm sorry for his loss," sent through my wife instead of to me directly, as though grief itself needed an intermediary when it came to acknowledging my existence. I share all of this not for sympathy. I've made my peace with those years, mostly, and I think the dinner in that ballroom closed a chapter that needed closing. I share it because I think it's important, if you're someone watching this who has lived a version of this story yourself, to know that the small things count. They add up, and you don't have to confront every single one of them in the moment they happen. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply remember them clearly, stay calm, and wait for the moment when the truth can do more good than another small, exhausting argument ever could. That's what I did for 8 years. I waited. Not because I was planning some grand reveal. I want to be honest, again, that the timing of everything that happened with the company and the venue was never engineered as a trap. It was simply life, unfolding the way it unfolds. And when the moment came that Diane finally pushed past the line I'd quietly drawn for myself 8 years earlier, I had 8 years of clarity ready to meet it. If you've ever kept a quiet record of small cruelties, not for revenge, but just so you'd never doubt your own memory of what actually happened, comment the word "record" below. I want to know I'm not the only one. The party didn't end in chaos. That's worth saying clearly, because I know some of you are expecting a dramatic exit, a slammed door, a scene. That's not what happened. Diane sat down. The dessert course was served. Conversations slowly resumed around the table, quieter than before, charged with the particular electricity of a room that has just witnessed something it will discuss for years. Renee stayed close to me for the rest of the evening, her hand finding mine more than once, a small, steady gesture that said more than words could have. Paige approached me near the end of the night, her expression somewhere between embarrassment and genuine reconsideration. "I didn't know any of that," she said. "About the company, about the loan." "I know," I said. "Nobody did. That was sort of the point, for a long time." "I'm sorry," she said, "for what I said last week, about Renee settling." I nodded. I didn't need a long apology from Paige. I'd never needed anyone's apology, really. That was the truth I'd discovered somewhere around year 5 of this marriage, the thing Diane had never understood about me. I wasn't waiting for this family's validation. I'd stopped waiting a long time ago. What happened that night wasn't me finally getting the recognition I'd secretly craved for 8 years. It was simply the truth, surfacing on its own timeline, because Diane had finally pushed hard enough that staying silent stopped being the right choice. Diane found me alone near the garden entrance around 11, most of the guests having filtered out, the string lights still glowing over empty tables. "I owe you an apology," she said. "No audience this time, no performance, just the two of us, and 8 years of history standing between us in the dark." "You do," I said, not unkindly, just honestly. "I don't know why she started, then stopped, seeming to genuinely search for an answer. "I think I decided who you were before I ever gave you a chance to show me otherwise. And once I'd decided, I just kept looking for things that confirmed it." "I know," I said. "I figured that out a long time ago. Why didn't you ever tell me? About the company? About any of it?" I thought about that question for a long moment, because it deserved an honest answer. "Because I didn't build any of it for you," I said. "I built it for myself, And for Renee, and because Walter believed in me when almost nobody else did. Your opinion of me stopped being something I needed a long time ago, Diane. I just got tired of being introduced without a name. Diane was quiet for a while. Somewhere in the garden, the last of the string lights flickered slightly in the breeze. I'd like the chance to actually get to know you, she said finally, if you're willing. I am, I said. I've been willing for 8 years. I'm glad you finally are too. If you believe people deserve a chance to make things right, even after 8 years of getting it wrong, comment the word second chance below. It's been 4 months since that night. Diane and I have had dinner, just the two of us, 3 times now, something that never happened once in the previous 8 years. It's not perfect. Old patterns don't dissolve overnight, and there are still moments where I catch the old condescension trying to surface before she catches herself and stops it. But she's trying, in a way she never tried before, and I've found that I'm able to meet that effort with something I didn't expect to feel toward her again. Patience. The same patience I'd been extending for 8 years, except now it's actually being met halfway. The first of those dinners was, predictably, awkward. We sat across from each other at a quiet restaurant Diane chose, not Ashford Manor, I noted. And I think that was deliberate on her part. A small acknowledgement that she wasn't ready to sit in a building that represented everything she'd gotten wrong about me. For the first 20 minutes, neither of us said much beyond logistics, how Renee was doing, whether I'd tried the salmon, the kind of conversational scaffolding people use when they don't yet trust themselves with real silence. Then, somewhere around the second course, Diane set down her fork and said, I've been thinking about something you said. About never asking you a real question in 8 years. And? I said. You're right, she said. I don't actually know what you find interesting about your work. I don't know what made you want to be an engineer in the first place. I don't know your favorite book, or what you wanted to be when you were a kid, or literally anything about you that isn't connected to Renee. It was, I think, the first completely honest thing Diane Whitfield had ever said to me in 8 years. So I told her. I told her about growing up the son of a high school physics teacher who used to take me to bridge construction sites on weekends just to watch the cranes work. I told her about the first building I ever helped design, a community center in a town I'd long since forgotten the name of, and how I still drove past it sometimes when work took me near there, just to see it still standing. I told her about Walter, and what it meant to have someone believe in me enough to hand over 22 years of his life's work without asking for anything beyond my word that I'd run it well. Diane listened, really listened, in a way I'm not sure she'd ever listened to anyone in her life. Certainly not to me. By the end of dinner, she didn't apologize again. I think she understood, by then, that one apology wasn't going to undo 8 years, and that the real work was going to be these small, accumulating moments of actually seeing me, the same way the small accumulating moments of dismissal had once defined our entire relationship. The second dinner was easier. The third is easier still. We're not close, not yet. I don't think either of us expects 8 years of distance to dissolve into warmth over a handful of meals, but something has shifted that I genuinely didn't expect to shift. Diane asks questions now. Real ones. She remembered at our last dinner a detail about a property acquisition I'd mentioned in passing weeks earlier, and asked a thoughtful follow-up about it, the kind of small thing that would have meant nothing from anyone else, but from Diane, after 8 years of silence, felt almost disorienting in its decency. Renee and I are doing better than ever. Strange thing to say after a night like that, but it's true. There's something that happens in a marriage when one partner finally sees the other one fully witnessed, finally watches the rest of the world catch up to what they already knew. Renee told me, a few weeks later, lying in bed one night when neither of us could sleep, that she'd always known I was building something real. She just hadn't realized how much I'd been carrying alone, quietly, for her sake, to avoid forcing her to choose between the two people she loved most. You should have told me, she said, about all of it. The card, Christmas with the wine, any of it. What would you have done? I asked her. Confronted your mother? Made every holiday a battlefield for 8 years? She was quiet for a long moment. I don't know, she admitted finally. Maybe. Probably. That's exactly why I didn't tell you, I said. I didn't want you carrying my battles on top of your own grief about your father. on top of everything you already carried being her daughter. I could absorb it. I didn't want you to have to. Renee cried that night. Not from sadness exactly, but from something closer to a complicated gratitude. The recognition of a kind of love that had been operating quietly in the background of her entire marriage, invisible until the moment it finally surfaced in front of 42 witnesses in a ballroom neither of us had expected to become the setting for the truth. Walter Cho still calls me every few weeks, mostly to talk through new property opportunities, occasionally just to check in. He told me, a few weeks after the party, that he'd known something like that night was coming eventually, not the specifics, but the inevitability of it. You can't underestimate a person forever, he told me over coffee. Eventually, the truth gets too big to stay quiet. I just didn't think it'd happen at an anniversary party. Neither did I told him honestly. Paige and I have a better relationship now too, though it's taken more work than the one with Diane, oddly enough. She flew back out 2 months after the party, alone this time, and asked if she could take me to lunch, just the two of us. No Renee, no Diane. She apologized again, more fully this time, for years of comments she'd absorbed secondhand from her mother without ever questioning them. I think I just always assumed Mom's version of things was the accurate one, she told me. I never thought to ask whether it might not be. I told her what I'd told Diane, more or less, that I didn't need the apology for my own sake, but that I appreciated her willingness to actually look at the situation honestly, instead of defending the comfortable version she'd believed for years. I still own Ashford Manor. I still run Whitfield Property Group, now 12 properties instead of 11, with a new acquisition closing next month. An old textile mill outside the city that everyone else in the market has written off as unsalvageable, the kind of project that makes other investors raise their eyebrows and makes me, if I'm honest, a little excited in a way that's hard to explain to people who don't see what I see in a building like that. I still don't talk about any of it much at family dinners, not because I'm hiding it anymore, everyone knows now, but because I've never needed an audience for the things I build. That was never the point, and it still isn't. I think that's the part of this story I'd want anyone watching to understand most clearly. None of what I built over those 8 years was constructed as a weapon. It became one, eventually, in the moment Diane forced my hand. But that was never the purpose. The purpose was simply to build something real, something mine, in a life where one person had decided, before she ever really knew me, that I wasn't worth the effort of finding out. The point was simply this. I spent 8 years being underestimated by someone who decided who I was before she ever bothered to find out. And when the moment finally came to correct the record, I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to humiliate her the way she'd tried to humiliate me. I didn't need a single raised word, a single dramatic gesture, a single moment of cruelty in return for the cruelty I'd absorbed for nearly a decade. I just told the truth, calmly, in front of the people who needed to hear it. Sometimes that's the only justice that actually matters. Not the loud kind, not the kind that leaves wreckage behind it. Just the quiet, factual, undeniable kind, the kind that doesn't need to raise its voice, because the truth, once it's finally spoken, doesn't need any help carrying its own weight. I think about that ballroom sometimes. The silence after Diane's toast, the longer silence after mine, the particular sound 42 people make when they're recalibrating everything they thought they understood about a family in real time. I don't think about it with anger anymore. I think about it the way you think about a long winter finally ending. Not with triumph, exactly, just relief, and the quiet, steady knowledge that spring was always going to come eventually, whether anyone believed it would or not. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever had to wait years for the truth to finally be seen, if you've ever quietly built something real while the people closest to you underestimated every bit of it, do me a favor. Like this video, subscribe for more stories like this one every week, and tell me in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who never bothered to actually get to know you? I read every single comment, and I want to hear your story. If you're new here, this channel is built entirely around stories like this one. Quiet people, pushed too far, who find their justice not through anger, but through the truth finally being told. If that's the kind of story that keeps you watching, this is exactly the right place for you. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and I'll see you in the next one.